Hello, it's Aaron Renn. Welcome back to the podcast. My guest today is Leah Libresco Sargeant. She is a writer who publishes the Other Feminisms Substack and is the author of the new book, The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. So, Leah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, I have met you, so I know you a little bit, but I don't really know you well, got to be honest. And I thought that the book was really interesting for me because I learned some kind of fascinating stuff about your life that made me more curious. So I want to kind of ask a little bit about your background and have that. So you're Catholic, right?
That's right.
And are you part of that Hyattsville, Maryland mafia?
I sure am.
Okay. So there's this great Catholic community there. Is Tim Carney? Is that where he lives?
No, he's all the way out in Virginia.
Okay, he was somewhere else. I knew he had a bunch of other ones. I didn't know if he was there because I interviewed him and he is. But I hear great things about Hyattsville.
It's fantastic. We moved here because we saw when we were visiting, it was a snowstorm, and our friends let their kids go out without them in their big puffy snowsuits. And because they're so anonymizing, the kids all look like giant starfish, right? It took us a few minutes after the kids come back to realize it was different kids who had come in. That the kids just were all released into the neighborhood. They ran into friends, they brought them back, and we went, that's what we want for our family.
Oh wow! Now I didn't know that you come from a Jewish family. So uh, how did you get from Jewish to Catholic?
So my family was never practicing while I was a kid. We don't remember who the last person on my mom's side was to practice.
Hmm.
We tended to get kicked out of Europe early ahead of the rush because my family sided with Zola during the affair Zola and was out nice and early, which turned out to be providential. So I grew up with kind of a very New York cultural Jewish upbringing. Interest in books, interest in argument, not religious. And I grew up in a fairly non religious neighborhood. So when I was in AP European in high school, a kid actually raised their hand to ask, do Lutherans still exist? When we were learning about the Reformation, and the teacher had to clarify, yes, they do.
Oh, interesting. Well, that was your entree into thinking about religion.
Well, I thought about it already. I was growing up kind of I was in high school and the very beginning of college during the peak of the new atheism, the Four Horsemen, Sam Harris, Hitchens, Dawkins, etc. And it meant I thought about religion a lot, but I thought about it insofar as it made possibly false claims that could impinge on my life.
Hmm. So it was in college that you ended up becoming Catholic?
Just afterwards, but college did a
Yeah.
lot of preparing the ground.
Yeah.
So I joined a debate group that's what I would describe as a philosophical debating circle rather than a debate team. So you only argue things you actually think rather than randomly chosen sides. There are no judges, no prizes. The reason you're having this debate is because someone might change their mind.
Hmm. Well, your family was also very liberal, you mentioned in the book. So your mother not only kept her own name when she got married, but with you you actually were given your mother's last name, not your father's last name, because they wanted to be countercultural.
And it was
Uh,
hard. They had to go back to the county clerk's office twice to get it recorded that way. And it still caused me some problems when I got my learner's permit because the county clerk ultimately whited out my dad's name and typed my mom's over it. And reasonably, I show up to the DMV when I'm 16 and they're like, so you're handing us a forged document? I'm like, well,
uh,
I didn't forge it.
oh, yeah. So I don't know, like you're like a hardcore conservative or anything, but if you're Catholic, you've clearly moved in some kind of a more conservative direction over the course of your life, which is the opposite of the direction that a lot of people uh, end up going. Uh, how did you end up as a writer? Because in the book, the stories you tell about your education all seem to be sort of STEM stories about math class and math competitions and chemistry and computer science. You seem to be like hardcore into that. And now you're, I think of you as kind of a literary figure.
Well, I think there's actually a strong trend or through line of storytelling within STEM because you're fundamentally looking at the world and going, what's going on here? What could be the chain of causes that leads to what I observed? I loved growing up. There's this book by Paul van der Kroof, Microbe Hunters, that's about Pasteur and Emile Roux and all the different researchers who kind of understood the germ theory of disease and what we could do. And they're really working to establish a new field. And when you do that, you are saying, all right, I've noticed these three weird things. What kind of story could make them fit together? So I feel like my storytelling and my math and science background like very much fit together.
Well, that brings you to the book. So I don't want to take all the time talking about you because I know we have a book to promote. It's called The Dignity of Dependence. And there is a link to buy it in the show notes. I will tell everyone out there. When I post it on my Substack, I'll even put an image of the cover that you can click. But what is the dignity of dependence?
I'd say it's two ideas linked together in a cruciform way, hopefully. The two ideas are that women's equality with men does not depend on our being interchangeable with men, and that dependence is not a brief, embarrassing, aberrational state, but the basic pattern of human life.
Yeah, well, um, what makes it a feminist manifesto?
Thank you for asking. I put that on the title to make it clear, because especially the dignity of dependence, the picture of the pregnant woman, like, is this a soft focus journaling book? And Feminist Manifesto makes it clear it's not. I think it's a feminist manifesto because the central claim of feminism throughout the many fights over what that is justice to women is different than justice to human beings in a broad sex neutral way. The question is, who are women and what are they owed in respect of their being women? And that really goes to that argument that it doesn't make sense to try and view the world from the point of view or to build it for a human being unsex neutral, because no such person ever has or ever will exist. To build a just society, we need to talk about who women and men are and what we owe in justice to each of them. And I think often we build around a default male environment. Not in all cases, I think school is a big outlier in that respect. But when we do that, we treat women like defective men who have to figure out how to fit into a way of being or just even a physical shape that isn't natural to us and requires us to make up the deficiency.
Yeah, I mean, some of this I couldn't relate to. I have to be honest. I think one of the stories you start with is that you say that like kitchen countertops are actually not at the correct height for women, or at least a lot of them, because
Yeah,
you're too short for the height of the kitchen
which is
counter.
crazy because you'd think if you're going to go, oh no, we live in a sexist society, the one good thing you should get out of a sexist society is countertops that are sized for women.
Right? I'm like, wow, these things fit perfectly for me. I'm 5 foot
Mhm,
10. They're right
mhm.
there. But when I read this, so coming at this from kind of my kind of outsider's lens, not having this perspective, it seemed like a lot of what you were talking about reminded me of what you might call the productive household movement. So a lot of it seems to be about not so much patriarchy or anything of that nature, but the way that essentially industrial technological society has undermined this sort of maybe rich variety of human experiences and also this sort of interpersonal care and provision one for another that previously characterized society. The standardized countertop is an industrial artifact because we want to have a standard height that's right for every single person. Whereas maybe if in your old days you would have built some cabinets that were just right for you. So you're talking about those things. You talk about like care for the sick and things of that nature versus institutional care. I mean, to what extent do you see yourself uh, in that sort of vein? Of you hear kind of a little bit of a critique of modernity in there, and how does that relate?
Yeah, I think this is where we're always trying to look at our tools and say, are these tools serving human beings? Or are these tools asking human beings to make ourselves smaller, more standardized to better serve the tools? And one of the examples I talk about are breast pumps, which I'm not against, but are very much designed to make babies less burdensome to employers rather
Mm.
than to help moms particularly. And I think part of the way you can tell that is a big selling point when they're marketed is, well, this is, very quiet. The motor is very quiet, which means the motor is much weaker. It's less good at
Mm.
its job, but it's quieter, so it won't bother anyone else in your office. And you look at some of these tools like this, you say, okay, this isn't so much a tool about giving me more room to answer the needs of my children. I'd say a dishwasher is like that. If I spend less time washing dishes, I can give myself more fully to reading bedtime books. Great. But this is a tool that's about attenuating need and making it less troublesome for other people without actually giving me more space for the most human relationships I have.
Yeah, you talk a lot about, I guess, women in the workplace and pregnancy, and you mentioned breast pumps and nursing and all of these things. You talk about investment banking and the long hours there. It wasn't totally clear to me how you think the work world ought to be redesigned, because it seems like you realistically say we're not going to all go back and live on the homestead, so we're all going to have jobs, and you want women to have those jobs. So what should employers be thinking about in the design of the work that makes it more designed around women's needs?
Well, and I should put my cards on the table. I am a working mom.
Hmm.
So I've worked part-time for a few years with my kids. I've worked mostly remotely, hybrid remotely, and I've chosen jobs that have some flexibility to them. And I think thinking about what a parent track looks like in your place of employment as an employer is a way of thinking about how can my business not just serve customers, but serve our community by providing a range of good jobs? And I think it's reasonable that for moms, especially, and for parents a little more broadly, that involves jobs that may be able to be part time, may have flexible work hours or flexibility on how often you're in the office. I mean, when you just think about the ways that parents, kids' school days do not end at the time the workday does, there's that question of, okay, well, what jobs let you do a little bit of asynchronous work? What jobs let you be with your kids after school, etc.? There's a model of this I really love from the Bruderhof and Anabaptist community, where I think it's common to design a factory flow around, well, I'm going to work with kind of a standard worker. They're all going to be able to lift this much, do this much, work the
Hmm.
same hours. And the Bruderhof didn't design their factory that way. They said, all right, well, this factory is meant to both produce things for outside of our community and serve our community of workers. So which parts of the factory line can we design for people who cannot stand up? Though it can be totally designed around sitting. Which parts can the oldest members of our community slot into? They would have designed it very differently if they thought, we'll pick the cream of the crop from around us, the youngest, strongest people with the fewest obligations after work. And they said, no, no. This factory is meant to be something that anyone in our community can find a way to communicate to. So the factory line is designed around that assumption.
So again, this is like the industrial economy wants standardized products. I mean, that's
Yes.
neoliberalism is
Mhm.
essentially, and it's even on a global level, because if that's why every city in the world looks the same. In order to invest in a product, it has to look like something investable. So it has to have the same glass box skyscraper or a mall or apartment building, no matter where you are in the world. And it
The blonde
is,
wood is how you know this is a coffee shop, just in
yeah.
case the sign didn't tell you.
And everybody complains about that, and we all complain about it. But I think that the capitalist person would say, look, this stuff you're talking about with the Bruderhof is inherently inefficient, and this will make our society poorer if we try to do it this way, or it's just really not possible to have all of these kind of one-off solutions. What would you say to an objection like that?
I think part of the luxury of living in a prosperous society is that we can choose some goods that aren't efficiency. It doesn't mean we choose them in every case. We have to be thoughtful and prudential about where does efficiency buy us a lot. I'm pretty glad that my kids' diapers are not made by hand in an artisanal way with limited quality control. I want to buy the same box of diapers and know it's doing the same thing every time, and I want them made as cheaply as possible given how many of them we go through. So I think it's less that we just turn the dial strongly towards efficiency or strongly away and say, okay, what are the trade offs here? And where do we want to make the trade off against efficiency in favor of a different good? Whether that's being able to employ a broader range of the people in the community, being able to have the slack to give people sick leave. I've worked at a company where one of the big things we were doing, it was a small startup, and we had to figure out, all right, how much redundancy do we need to build in here? For a variety of reasons. Some of them are for the sake of the employees. We had one guy who couldn't ever take vacation because he was the only one who knew how to handle our international wires. So we needed to build in redundancy so we didn't lose him as an employee, because most people don't want to stay at a job where you can never ever take vacation because no one's been cross-trained on your work. But also, to be able to give someone maternity or paternity leave means you're running a company that in some sense is inefficient. It can manage without someone for a few months. It has someone else who can take over this job. It's not running at the bleeding edge of what you can squeeze out of what you're working with. And I think that allows you to employ human beings, which is a worthwhile trade-off. But the question of how much leave, how much redundancy is kind of prudential based on the business you're in.
I do think we've done somewhat what you say, but really it's become the luxury option for rich people. Is that
Mhm.
they can afford to have the artisanally produced loaf of bread that they picked up at the farmer's market, or the guy with his own soap making business, which I interviewed those people who did it. So we've created a segregated experience that's probably for the elite, and I think that that's also true of jobs as well. Most of the flexibility seems to be granted to people who are perceived as delivering a lot of financial value to the company. I interviewed Farrah Stockman of the New York Times. She wrote a book about factory life in Indiana. And she, one of the people she profiled was a single mom who worked in the factory, was taking care of a disabled grandchild,
Mhm.
actually. And it was, wow, most of my feminist agenda is completely irrelevant to her life. It's around oriented around people like me. So I think we've done some of it, but it seems to be very oriented towards people at the highest end of the spectrum,
I
rather
think there's
than
decent
we
middle
sort of
class
allocated it.
jobs.
Hmm?
Yeah, there's decent middle class jobs where you can build this in more. I think, jobs like bookkeeping are something where it's important this get done within this period of time, but is it important it happen in the next hour? Hopefully not. Usually when you have a next hour emergency for your bookkeeper, several other things have already gone wrong. So that's the kind of job where I've seen more semi stay at home moms have an easier time leaning into part-time work, taking on a couple clients, easing in, easing out, depending on the balance. But you're right that some jobs do require you need to be here at exactly this time. Every day something is happening. It does matter that it happened this moment, not in an hour when your kid is napping. And my husband has one of those jobs because he's a high school teacher. So when our kids are sick, I, as the think tanker, am the one who stays home because it's very rare that there is a think tank emergency, happily.
Hmm.
And that's why I'm in that job. But every day, if he doesn't go in, the kids don't learn. So his job is much more demanding in that case because it's happening continuously, and mine is more batched. It can have busy periods and slow periods and flex a little with the rhythms of my life.
Yeah, it is interesting to think through this. I've spent a lot of time thinking over this because endless ink has been spilled over the negatives of, again, industrial modernity, and yet none of us really wants to go back to the old system. And we're here where there is no going back unless we become Amish. And even the Amish do their shopping in like real stores and things like that. Yeah, they're not exactly eating an artisanal diet, if you know anything about how the Amish eat. So I'm kind of like, man, it's a little bit like as of necessity. I struggle with this. Like, how can we sand off some of the rough edges
Mhm.
here? But it's
I
it's
I really
harder.
think about it as what will you buy? Like you're going to
Mm,
sacrifice efficiency in some parts of your life, whether for your comfort or for the time you spend with family. So you're always thinking, okay, what am I going to buy with this countercultural movement? And for me, it's often that sense of, okay, well, I want a less fast-paced job. I know that. I could take a different kind of job, and I'm taking the kind of job where there are no emergencies, no one calls me after work, and I can work at home 3 days a week. That's one of the trade-offs I'm making. Then we make kind of different trade-offs. We have very few screens in our house, so lots of time together reading good books. And we also, if everyone is exhausted, eat off paper plates sometimes where we're leaning
Mhm.
into the industrial disposable
Mhm.
society because we say, we have no dishwasher, by the way. My dishwasher earlier was entirely hypothetical. We go, okay, we want to have friends over. This became a very busy week. We want to order pizza and eat off paper plates so that the thing we're trading off, we're buying efficiency on the food side so that we can luxuriate in inefficiency of having people over in our house. I think just being more deliberate, saying a lot of things will pull me towards the standardized, the quick, the convenient, the distant. Where do I want to lean in to what's cheap to buy what I really need?
Most of my audience is men, and you
Mhm,
have a chapter. I do have a lot of female
mhm.
readers, though, by the way, so you're going to get some of them. But you have a chapter on men in the book, and I think it's a really essentially impossible to talk about women as distinct from humanity as opposed to like women as distinct from men. And so I'll
Absolutely.
just full disclose, Erica Bakayoko asked me to write a response to that chapter, which I haven't done yet. So this might be ammunition for it. But so
Mhm.
that so how do you see men fitting into this framework, both in terms of the dependency framework, but also like how you would like men to um, think about the needs of women more.
Yeah, part of how I think about it is that both men and women are called to respond to the dependence of others, to extend your body over someone in protection. But the paradigmatic experiences of what that look like are very different. For women, obviously, it's pregnancy, where your body becomes the literal shelter for a baby. But what I think is interesting and distinctively feminine is much of that is done without actively willing it. You don't get pregnant. You get pregnant by having sex, but not by thinking during sex, "Baby, baby, baby," even when that's what you want, it comes
Mhm.
as a gift. And then moment by moment, your baby needs more calcium. Well, I don't sit up thinking, "Yes, 30 cc's of calcium to the baby, here we
Mm.
go." The baby draws on me without my willing. And in labor, the baby, not the woman, initiates that process. Versus for men, the paradigmatic experience of putting your body on the line for someone is actively stepping forward, not passively embracing something that's already happening. And historically, that's standing over your family to protect them in war, standing to protect them against violent disorder outside your house, putting your body on the line through difficult physical work to make sure your family has enough to eat. We're a prosperous and safe enough society that men don't get a lot of those invitations by default. And I think just like I'm happy to have machine-made diapers, I think we're allowed to be grateful for that. But then the question is, where are those opportunities to step forward? The experience of being a married woman and of going through pregnancy for me 9 times, 6 times with children I lost, and 3 times with children we carried successfully to term, is the experience of me sinking further into weakness for the sake of the baby who's even weaker than me, the baby who draws on my body in ways that make it harder for me to do stuff that's part of the normal balance of our household, and my husband actively stepping forward, not just in terms of taking over household tasks, but being the person with more energy, putting his body on the line, supporting me through labor, holding me up through contractions. But I think it's very weird if for men that big ask only comes in marriage. And I think part of the challenge is when you see teenage boys growing into their full strength, shooting up above their peers, they're bursting with physical strength. And I think the question that they all have implicitly is, what is this for? Why am I bigger than other people? For Christian boys, why did God give me this? What am I supposed to do with this talent? And I think we really shortchange young men when we don't ask things of them, when we, you know, hire a service to shovel out in the winter rather than saying, "Oh yeah, the parish will send a teenage boy to your house," because part of what we recognize is you've been through puberty now. Like you're big, you're strong, you owe that strength to Mrs. O'Sullivan down the street. And but for you, she'd have trouble getting out of her house safely. I think we as a prosperous society, treat more of the needs that are historically met by men as things you buy from strangers in the market, not things you ask of the men in your community, because they have this strength that's excess to their needs living on their own, strength that is intended for the weaker members of their community.
If you read about manhood, like if you read David Gilmour's Manhood in the Making and other things, people always say, men are sort of treated as expendable, more expendable. They're expected to be willing to, you have to go out and die fighting the enemies, and there's all these different evo-psych reasons people come up with for that. But in this kind of this rubric of dependency, what should men be asking more for from other people in terms of helping them?
I think it's clear that we look at the kind of crisis of deaths of despair for men that a lot of the time men who wind up in the worst places considering suicide say they don't feel like they're needed. They're not knit into a community. They don't have even those moments of side by side friendship. Um, I think part of what men need to ask for is more spaces where people are together and offline. Like when you look at the difference between going to a game with friends or even going to the bar with friends to watch a game, you're with each other cheering and talking versus you and your friends are all on DraftKings putting in your parlays, but you're not together and you're kind of in no sense, even when you're fans of the same team, rooting for the same things. You're rooting for this many points. You're no longer rooting for the Bills, right? Um, we're looking for more places where people are embodied together and both celebrate and labor together. So I think that's what we need more space for.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like the deaths of despair, feeling useless. I think a lot. There is a sense that like a lot of well, it's like if we don't need you, you can just shut you off to the side, and you can
Mhm.
just kill yourself. Implicitly or explicitly, and nobody really
Well,
cares.
yeah, I think men
That's where.
should have an answer to what will break if I'm not there. And
Yeah.
when they don't feel like they have an answer, it's not because they're not necessary. It's because not enough need has been opened up for them to step into. But I guarantee for every man who feels like, well, I'm not needed, I'm not necessary, I'm superfluous, he is needed, but we haven't opened up the channels of connection through a parish, through a neighborhood that allow him to see where he is needed.
I want to kind of maybe just wrap up the conversation with one of the themes that you run through the book, which is autonomy and our relationship to autonomy and how we our desire for autonomy in this world. Like, what role does autonomy play in kind of our modern self conception, and how does that differ maybe from the past and how we should think about it?
I think the very modern idea of autonomy is that I am by default untouchable, that my relations to others are voluntary, that because I take them on, they're kind of hobbies. And you see this in the way people talk about pregnancy. Well, if you couldn't take care of the baby, you shouldn't have gotten pregnant, as though and if your parents, are having struggles, then, well, that's not your problem, that they should have saved more money. Not obviously, everyone in the world is kind of trailing connections to people they love, whether by blood or by friendship. And those connections can be more than you can answer yourself. But autonomy says, no, I'm myself, I'm untouchable, I'm buffered, I take on what I choose to take on. And when I'm overwhelmed by someone else's need, something's gone wrong. And in some sense, that's an assault on me and my personhood, which should be inviolate. And I think many people wouldn't endorse it framed that way, but then they endorse it in many little ways. Even just the language of a baby as a parasite, not a person, implies the natural state is that no one can interrupt me, and a baby does. But if I'm completely childless, whether infertile, unmarried, not wanting children, I'm not let off the hook of needing to lay down my life for others, needing to be Christ to others. I'm still called to do that. I'm called to do that in a different way than being a mother. Everyone's lives are interruptible. Everyone's lives are at the service of their community and the people near them. And if you can't find anyone who can crash into your life, you need to open the door and invite people to. I think it's that sense of untouchability that ultimately leads to that sense of I'm not needed.
Yeah, I think about in the book, abortion obviously is like I can just, that's the autonomy. In fact, it's typically framed in terms of autonomy.
It's framed as
Abortion.
though women's autonomy they already possess is imperiled by lack of abortion. And my claim is you never had that.
Right.
No one made that promise to you. Men don't have it either. And I think that's really important. Men can't lose their autonomy to a baby in quite the same way, but men also do not stand alone. They're still tied to other people.
I think about Socrates refusing to flee the city when they imposed the
Hmm.
death sentence on him. He's like, this is what it means to be an Athenian. They're not going to
Yeah.
pay the price there. And yeah, this it seems like the autonomy thing. It's ever more of it. Just seems to be there. I know so many uh, people who are worried their kids are going to cut them off. Like at least like young kids are always like, well, you just need to cut your parents off if they're not if they vote for Trump or if they do this or if they do that. It seems like this idea is like, I have no obligations to these people whatsoever. They have obligations to me. And if they're not doing what I'm wanting, then I'm just going to like, screw them.
Hmm. I think some of this also comes out of the idea, what do you do when your own strengths don't feel like they're sufficient for a relationship, when you don't have a way of solving a problem, when you live alongside someone who, whether they're your difficult parent and you don't know how to get past the difficulty, your disabled child where you can't keep them safe forever past your death, what do you do? And I think in a secular context, there's more of a sense of, well, we reach a point where we seem to have obligations to people, but we can't fully discharge them. And you can't be required to do something you're not able to do. So there must be no obligation here. If I can't figure out how to reconcile with my mother,
Mhm.
I must not have an obligation here. And I think again, the refuge of the Christian, and secretly the refuge of everyone, since you and I agree that that's
Mhm.
true, is we are never powerless in those situations because we can draw on God, because we can commend others in prayer. If I have a difficult relationship with my mother, I can say, well, she is my mother forever. And as long as I'm praying for her and I keep asking the Holy Spirit to help us, none of that will guarantee we get along at any point in our life. But I can guarantee that no love I offer to someone else in union with God's love is wasted. I just can't predict the shape its expression will take.
Well, that's great. I'm tempted to end it right there because that's such a great thought. But I want to give you one final opportunity because, like, I read the book as the man reading the book.
Mhm.
Is there something in there that I missed that you would really like to make sure we tell people about, or at least tease so they'll actually buy it?
Sure. I think if nothing else, the reason you should buy this book, man or woman, is because if you're of an age where you have parents who are aging, there is going to be a period in your life where they may look to you to ask, does my dependence mean I shouldn't keep living? And it's not going to just matter the answer you to give to them in that moment. It's going to matter the answer you've been giving them your whole life in terms of whether you see weakness as an embarrassing failure or as part of the pattern of human life. And if nothing else, I say this is a feminist manifesto. I hope it gives women better ways to understand what it means to be a woman, better ways to understand what it means to be a man. But most of all, I hope it gives people faith that there's no human life that is not touched by dependence and no person who is made not a person by virtue of their need. And I think increasingly we're seeing countries, especially Canada, but the US and the UK too, really start to explore the question that not only at the very beginning of life through abortion does someone's dependence on others make them a licit target for violence, now at the end of life, does your return to diapers make it licit for a doctor to kill you?
Yeah, scary stuff to say the
Hmm.
least. And Canada is definitely a cautionary tale there. My guest today, Leah Libresco Sargeant. Her book is called The Dignity of Dependence. Again, there is a link to buy it in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.